Attention! If you've ever felt the world turn its back on you, this story is for you. Are you ready to discover how betrayal can become your greatest strength? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like this video so you don't miss any of our inspiring stories. It was a cold night in the English countryside, but in the Thorne family mansion, the warmth came from heated arguments. Albert Thorne, the heir to the region's most prestigious vineyard, had just definitively broken with his father. The words they exchanged left no room for regret. "You'll never be half the man you think you are," the patriarch roared before slamming the study door. Albert, though known for his calculated coldness in business, sank into a thick silence. This time there was no retort, only rage and an almost childish loneliness. Isabella Rivers was about to finish her shift when she heard the sound of glass shattering. She knew that tone. She knew when he had had too much to drink. Cleaning up her boss's emotional wreckage had become her routine, even if it wasn't in her job description. Still, she climbed the stairs. "I know you prefer to be alone, but I brought you some coffee," she said, gently placing the cup on the table. He didn't respond. He just looked at her with red eyes, not just from the wine, but from pain. "Do you also think I'm a failure?" he asked with a twisted, bitter smile. Isabella hesitated. She sat down slowly, like someone entering sacred territory. "I think you're tired of fighting ghosts that aren't yours." He looked at her for the first time with genuine attention. The silence stretched between them, intimate and dense. It was the first time he had listened to someone who didn't treat him like a number or a threat. The wine bottle between them emptied quickly. Words flowed like never before. Isabella confessed that she cared for her mother with Alzheimer's, that she had left a fiancé in another city to pursue her dream of working with wines. Albert, in turn, spoke of the mother who died too soon and a father who never forgave him for it. For the first time, there were no walls between them. When he took her hand, it was as if the world stopped. There was no longer a difference between boss and assistant, between power and subordination. There were just two wounded hearts, seeking solace in each other's warmth. He slowly leaned in, expecting her to pull away. She didn't. The kiss was slow, almost hesitant. Then came the embrace, the touch, the abandonment of pain between fine linen sheets and unspoken promises. That dawn, Albert whispered his greatest secret. He had never wanted to follow his father's business. He wanted to open a small, artisanal winery with his own name. Something simple, something his. Isabella looked into his eyes, smiling. "You can do it. You just need courage." In the morning, he was already dressed, back to his mask of coldness. "You should leave," he said, without even looking at her. Isabella felt the immediate chill. Not a word about the night before. No affectionate farewell. Just the sound of the door closing behind her. But on the way home, something inside her told her that night hadn't just been an escape for him. She knew how to recognize a true touch, and she also knew, with an almost painful intuition, that something had changed within her. Something irreversible. Weeks later, looking at the pregnancy test in her trembling hand, she knew her life would never be the same. But what she didn't yet know was that she wasn't carrying just one life. There were 3 hearts beating inside her. Welcome to the Narratives and Memories channel. First of all, please leave a like. This way, YouTube will understand that our content is valuable and will show it to more people. It was days of silence. Isabella spent weeks trying to decide whether she should tell him. Maybe it had just been an emotional impulse. Maybe the pregnancy wouldn't prosper. But no. The constant nausea, the confirming tests, and above all that internal feeling, as if a greater force was guiding her, left no room for doubt. She was pregnant and needed to be honest. Even if her heart screamed with fear, she requested a formal meeting with Albert. He didn't even look up from his papers when she entered. "Make it quick. I have a video call in 10 minutes. The dry, professional tone churned her stomach. That night seemed like a distant delusion. Still, she took a deep breath, clutching the envelope with the tests between her fingers. "I'm pregnant, Albert, and the child is yours." The room froze. Albert looked up and stared at Isabella. His eyes showed no surprise, only disbelief. "Is this some kind of blackmail?" His voice cut like a knife. Isabella took a step back, as if she had been pushed. "No, it's not that. I just thought you had a right to know." He slowly stood up, and the ice in his gaze was almost unbearable. "To know? To know that you used a moment of my weakness to get pregnant and secure your future? Is that what you call honesty?" Every word was a slap to her soul. Isabella tried to hold back the tears, but they betrayed her. "I don't want anything from you. I just believed we should talk about this." "Talk about what? A mistake?" "You're no different from the others, Isabella. You knew what you were doing. You knew it was just one night. Just one." He took the envelope from her hand, looked at it without opening it, and threw it onto the desk as if it were trash. "You're fired. As of today, take your things and leave." Isabella's breath caught. She tried to say something, anything, but the words hid in her throat. The man she had known, vulnerable, sweet for a few moments, was completely buried under pride and scars he refused to heal. "You'll regret this, Albert. Not for me, but for our child." She said it without anger, only with the sadness of someone who already knows what's coming. He didn't respond, just turned his back on her and looked out the window, as if avoiding her gaze was also avoiding his responsibility. When the door closed, silence again took over the room. But this time, it wasn't peace. It was emptiness. In the elevator, Isabella broke down. She cried as she hadn't cried since her father's death. Not for the job, not for the contempt, but for having believed that perhaps, even if only a little, he had felt something that night. On the winery sidewalk, under the relentless midday sun, she placed her hand on her still imperceptible belly and whispered, "I promise you will be loved, even if only by me." Isabella left at dawn, without telling anyone. She took only what was necessary: a suitcase, an envelope with the tests, and a courage she didn't even know she possessed. The city seemed to breathe a sigh of relief at her absence, as if telling her there was no place for her there. She took any bus, with no fixed destination. She only knew she needed to get away from Albert's world, from his contempt, from his deafening silence. She arrived in Brighton, a coastal city of vibrant colors and slow rhythms. She rented a modest little room at the top of a villa, with a widowed lady named Mrs. Francis, who welcomed her with kind eyes and simple wisdom. "Loneliness hurts less when you're surrounded by the sea," she would say, preparing hibiscus tea with cinnamon on hot afternoons. The nausea intensified, and with it, the fear. On one of her hospital visits, after a more detailed examination, the doctor hesitated before smiling. "Get ready. There are 3. Isabella thought she had misheard. 3. The doctor pointed to the monitor. 3 small hearts beat in perfect synchronicity. 3 lifts. 3 opportunities to start anew. 3 reasons not to give up. She left the office stunned. She sat on a bench in the square and stayed there for hours, watching people come and go, trying to understand how to move forward. But then she remembered the words she whispered in the elevator weeks ago. "I promise you will be loved." Now, that promise was worth triple. The months passed with difficulty. She worked as a waitress in a cafe, then as a clothing seller at a local market, always with her belly growing and her soul divided between fear and strength. She cried in the shower. She had sleepless nights and moments when she thought of returning, looking for Albert, asking for help. But no, he didn't want them. He doesn't deserve them, she repeated like a mantra. Mrs. Francis became a grandmother by choice. She helped with advice, with warm broths, and even with old remedies to protect the pregnancy. Isabella learned to knit small crochet booties, and each pair represented a child. She kept the 3 in a small embroidered bag with the initials A, B, and C. She didn't know their names yet, but she already called them my miracles. When she went into labor, it was Mrs. Francis who ran with her to the hospital. It was an emergency C-section. Complicated. She almost couldn't withstand the pressure on her body. But when she woke up, sedated and pale, the nurse leaned in and said, "You had 3 strong and very, very beautiful boys." She cried like never before, not from pain, but from victory. She looked at the little ones lined up in the incubator, so fragile and so intense. And there, between the rhythmic sound of machines and the smell of hospital, Isabella Rivers was reborn as a mother. She promised herself that they would never know the feeling of rejection, that even if they had little, they would have everything, that they would live with dignity, with truth, and above all, with love. The small room with peeling paint barely had enough space for the improvised triple Moses basket that Mrs. Francis helped set up with wooden boxes, cushions, and recycled fabrics. But for Isabella, that space was the coziest palace in the world. There was laughter, even with tight budgets. There were lullabies, even when the power went out. And above all, there was a love so absolute that it made the absence of luxuries insignificant. Each of the boys had his own unique way of being. Gabriel was the calmest. He slept hugging his rag teddy bear, sewn by Miss Francis. Matthew was curious and already trying to crawl before the others. Samuel, on the other hand, cried easily, especially when he felt his mom was sad. They didn't speak yet, but they understood everything with their eyes, and their gaze was a pure mirror of the affection they received. The routine was exhausting, but it was also full of small miracles. Isabella learned to prepare nutritious purees with the bare minimum. She sold homemade sweets in the little square, while Mrs. Francis looked after the babies for a few hours. At night, she sewed by candlelight, hair bows, embroidered cushions, to sell at the Sunday market. There was almost nothing left over, but the essentials were never lacking. There were nights when she woke up startled, dreaming of the past, of Albert's cold eyes, and the words that still resonated in her mind. "You're no different from the others." In those moments, she hugged her children and cried in silence. They didn't know it, but they saved their mother every time they smiled. Mrs. Francis had become more than a neighbor. She was a maternal figure, an angel sent to balance the stormy days. "You don't need much to be happy, child. You just need to be sure that what you do has love." She always repeated that, while rubbing anise tea on the babies' colicky bellies. On the wall, Isabella taped a sheet with a simple drawing. 5 little stick figures holding hands. Written in marker was the title, "Our Family." It was the first thing she saw every morning as a reminder that, despite the circumstances, that was the home she chose to build. Over time, the community began to recognize her as the young woman with the triplets. She received sincere smiles at the bakery, notes of support at the door, and even anonymous donations left by the gate. It wasn't charity, it was recognition. Isabella conveyed dignity even when asking for help. It was impossible not to respect her struggle. Little by little, her heart began to heal. The wound Albert left still throbbed on certain cloudy days, but it no longer defined who she was. She was no longer the secretary who was fired. She was the woman who raised 3 children with her own hands, without surrendering to despair. The woman who learned to transform pain into hope and abandonment into love. That night, as she cradled the 3 in her arms, 2 asleep and 1 biting his own foot, Isabella looked at the starry sky through the open window and whispered, "I thought you had ruined my life, Albert Thorne. But without meaning to, you gave me everything." 3 years passed like a thick fog for Albert Thorne. On the outside, everything remained in order. Businesses prospered, the winery expanded into international markets, and the image of the Valley's Iron Man was celebrated by the press. But inside, the emptiness grew. At night, though surrounded by expensive glasses and millionaire contracts, he slept poorly. And in the few moments he managed to close his eyes, he always dreamed of the same thing: a woman walking away in silence, carrying in her womb something he had never seen. It was a sweltering afternoon in Manchester when fate decided to act. Albert was on a business trip, and after an exhausting meeting, he stopped for lunch at a simple restaurant. He didn't want ostentation. He wanted a bit of normalcy. The waiter led him to a table in the corner, and it was there, upon ordering a tamarind water, that he saw her. Isabella. Her back was to him, but he recognized her immediately. The way she gathered her hair, her light laugh, the way she delicately picked up her napkin. She was sitting with 3 identical children, 3 children who were devouring tortillas and laughing at something she said. Albert froze. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But then one of the children turned, and his world stopped. The eyes. The same eyes he had seen for years in the mirror. That same amber-brown tone, with a specific sparkle that not even the most common genetics could replicate. A mark of his family. The child blinked slowly, and for an instant, Albert felt that he too had recognized him. But it was impossible. He had never met them. He had never held them. He had never called them my children. The waiter approached to take his order, but Albert didn't even hear him. His mind was in collapse. What he had in front of him was the raw truth he had rejected 3 years ago. She hadn't lied. She had children. His children. Not knowing what to do, he slowly stood up, walking like a disoriented man. He stopped a few feet from the table. Isabella still hadn't seen him, but one of the children, Gabrielle, was watching him carefully. Suddenly, the little one whispered something to his brother. The 3 turned at the same time towards Albert, and silence fell like a stone. Isabella turned by reflex, trying to understand what had caught the children's attention. And then she saw him. Their gazes met. First came astonishment, then disbelief, and finally, the old fear. She stood up abruptly, as if about to flee. "Isabella," was all Albert managed to say. His voice came out weak, almost a whisper, but it was enough to awaken the ghosts. She grabbed the children's backpack with trembling hands. "Let's go, children. It's time to go." She tried to smile at them, but her expression betrayed the urgency of her escape. Albert took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the little ones. "They are..." The question hung in the air, suspended between past and present. Isabella took a deep breath. She knelt down and tied Samuel's shoe, as if that would buy her time. Not here, not now. And then she walked out the door with the 3 by her side, without looking back. Albert stood there, alone, surrounded by empty tables and untouched plates, feeling for the first time in years that there was something more important than business, than pride, than his image. Something he had let slip through his fingers. That night was the longest in Albert's life. Locked in the hotel suite, unable to touch the expensive wine on the table or answer the messages from the CFO who pleaded for answers, he drowned in memories. The children's faces returned like lightning flashes, every one of his features imprinted on them, as if fate had left obvious clues, clues he ignored for years. The next morning he couldn't wait. He tracked down Isabella's address. The restaurant waiter knew someone who lived in the same villa as her. When he arrived, he was not met with hostility, but with surprise. Mrs. Francis watched him from the terrace. Her eyes narrowed. "So it's you, you rascal," she said, before calling Isabella with a simple, "Child, the visitor has arrived." Isabella appeared minutes later, her hair pulled back in an improvised bun, dressed in simple clothes, and one of the children in her arms. Her gaze was hardened, but her eyes showed a shadow of nervousness. She didn't ask why he was there. She just said, "Not here. Let's walk." And so they walked side by side along a path near the sea. The sound of the waves was the only thing that filled the silence between them, until Albert bluntly asked, "They're mine, aren't they?" Isabella bit her lower lip, as if trying to contain an old pain. "You know they are." He looked away, clenching his fists. "Why didn't you look for me? Why did you disappear without saying anything?" She stopped walking. The wind played with the loose hairs on her neck. "You threw me out, with contempt, with hatred, with words I still hear when I close my eyes." Her voice trembled for an instant, but remained firm. "I didn't disappear. I survived." Albert felt a weight in his chest that no board meeting, no difficult negotiation had ever caused him. Guilt gnawed at him, but he didn't know how to deal with it. "I wasn't ready. I thought it was a lie, a trap." And then, as a reflection of his own cowardice, he said, "I want to do a DNA test." Isabella didn't answer immediately. She just looked at the sea. There was no anger in her eyes. There was exhaustion. "Do you still need proof, Albert, after seeing their eyes?" He was silent, defeated. But she understood. "All right, do the test. I have nothing to hide, but don't use that as an excuse to run away again." Days later, he returned with the papers in hand. A renowned laboratory, total discretion. Isabella received him with Matthew in her arms and just said, "They are not just yours by blood. They are yours if you decide to be a father, and no test can prove that." The test was done, and the following days were a whirlwind. Albert returned to the city, but he couldn't concentrate on anything. Every video call with the marketing team was interrupted by memories of the children's laughter, by the way Gabriel looked at him with curiosity, by Samuel's little hand grabbing the hem of his pants before leaving the restaurant. When the results arrived, he didn't need to open them to know the answer. But he did. 3 times. 3 genetic identifications. 3 confirmations. 3 children. The blood he had denied. The family he had rejected. Now the question was he ready to accept them? The envelope rested on the mahogany table, in the middle of a room that smelled of power, luxury, and emptiness. Albert looked at it as if it contained dynamite. It was sealed, but in his mind, it already screamed truths he had refused to hear for 3 years. The world around him whispered, "There's no way to pretend anymore." With trembling hands, he broke the seal. A dense silence fell over the room as he read, line by line, the clinical report. 99.99% genetic compatibility with individuals A, B, and C. 3 genetic identities. 3 children. 3 mistakes that now screamed to be corrected. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes tightly. But there was no way to erase reality. For the first time in years, Albert Thorne cried. He cried like a man who sees his entire life, built on walls of denial, crumble. The words he said to Isabella that morning, cold as ice, returned like needles. "You're no different from the others." That phrase now sounded absurd, cruel, inhuman. He walked through the house like a ghost. He passed through the great hall, looked at the paintings with the Thorne family genealogy. Names, dates, titles, and none of them now seemed to make sense. 3 little heirs ran through a coastal town without knowing who they were, while he hid behind reports and childish fears. He took the car aimlessly. He drove for hours until he stopped in front of the winery. The vines were tall. The sun gilded the leaves. He remembered walking there with his mother when he was a child. "You will be a good man, my son, if you are not afraid to love." That phrase, forgotten for so long, now echoed like a prophecy, and he had failed. At home, he opened the safe and took out a small wooden box with his mother's old objects. Photographs, letters, a brooch. Among them, a note he never knew she had written to him before she died. In a soft handwriting it said, "What you do with the feelings of others will say more about you than any inheritance you can carry." And the weight of guilt suffocated him. It was no longer the fear of being a father. It was the shame of having been a small man. A man who chose distance instead of dialogue, pride instead of affection. A man who allowed 3 lives to be born and grow without his presence, without his protection, without his affection. The next morning, he drove to Brighton without warning. He didn't bring escorts or a luxury car. He arrived as one who seeks redemption, not reconciliation. He knocked on Mrs. Francis's door with red eyes and a trembling voice. "They are my children, and I know it, but I don't know if I can still be something for them." Mrs. Francis looked deeply into his eyes, with the wisdom of one who has seen many falls and a few true redemptions. "You can't change what you did, son, but you can decide what you're going to do now, and only you can choose that." Albert looked towards the small patio where children's voices sounded like music. His heart raced. For the first time, not as a businessman or as an heir, but as a man, as a father. He knew the road would be long, perhaps full of resistance, but it was a path he needed and wanted to walk. Albert arrived earlier than agreed that morning. He wore a simple shirt, without the tailored jacket or the luxury watch he usually flaunted. In his hands he carried 3 toy cars, one for each child. Mrs. Francis received him with a knowing but serious look. "They don't know who you are yet. Go easy. Children recognize the truth faster than adults." In the patio, the triplets played barefoot, laughing with an overturned bucket they used as a drum. When Isabella appeared at the door with her hands full of bread dough, she froze when she saw him. She said nothing. She just wiped her hands on her apron and watched him from afar. Albert swallowed. The reunion with his children would not be like in soap operas. There would be no soft music or automatic hugs. There would be, however, reality. He knelt in front of the children, extending the toys to them. "Hello, I'm Albert. I brought you something." The 3 stopped, looking at him with distrust. Samuel was the first to take a step, but immediately returned to his brother's side, pulled by Matthew. The trio looked at each other, and instead of taking the gifts, ran towards Isabella. Albert's heart broke in silence. There were no screams or tears, but the gesture was enough for him to understand. They didn't know who he was, and what's more, they didn't trust him. Isabella walked up to him, took the cars from his hands, and placed them on the patio table. "They're afraid of strangers, and for now, That's what you are." He nodded without arguing, without protesting. He remained seated, watching them play from a distance. He tried to smile when Gabriel stumbled and got up by himself, but he felt like a guest at a party no one had invited him to. These children were not ungrateful. They were simply loyal to the only love they knew, hers. In the following days, he returned several times. He brought fresh juices, children's stories. He even tried to sing an old song his mother had taught him. Sometimes he got a giggle, other times not even a glance. It was delicate ground, and every false step could cost weeks of progress. One afternoon, Isabella found him sitting on the patio floor with one of the children by his side drawing. It was Matthew, the most observant. Albert held a colored pencil and tried to copy an airplane. "You're very bad at that," the child said with stinging sincerity. Albert laughed. "Yes, I know, but I'm trying." Matthew didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. It was a start. However, progress was slow. One night, Albert left the house with a broken heart after Samuel screamed, "I don't want him to come anymore," crying when he tried to touch him. Isabella just walked him to the gate and said softly, "They still don't understand who you were, and you still haven't shown them who you want to be." Albert stopped on the dark sidewalk with his hands in his pockets, looking at the sky. For the first time in his life, money was useless. The Thorn name meant nothing there, and he finally understood. Presence is not the same as fatherhood. Closeness does not replace affection. And love is built, one gesture at a time. Time, even for an impatient man like Albert, became an unexpected ally. He continued to go to Isabella's house every day, without demanding anything, without imposing his presence. He brought fresh fruit for snacks, fixed broken toys, and learned for the first time in his life what it meant to be present without expecting a reward. It was on a cloudy afternoon, one of those when the sky threatens rain, when something began to change. Albert was sitting on the patio, watching the children draw with colored chalk on the concrete floor. He had learned not to interfere, just to be near. When Matthew ran inside, Gabriel concentrated on coloring a sun with eyes and a smile. But it was Samuel, the most sensitive of the three, who approached. With timid steps and a sheet clutched in his little hands, Samuel stood in front of Albert. His brown eyes, identical to his father's, looked at him with a strange serenity. "It's for you," he said, extending the drawing. Albert took the sheet carefully, as if it were made of glass. There were 5 figures drawn with colored pencils, 3 small ones with thin legs and huge heads, the triplets, a woman in a lilac dress with her hair pulled back, Isabella, and by her side a tall man with what looked like a straw hat. Albert recognized his own suit jacket drawn in blue. Above the man's head, a misspelled word, Daddy. A lump formed in Albert's throat. Time stopped. He held the drawing tightly, as if he feared it might fly away. He tried to speak, but nothing came out. Only silent tears rolled down his face, not of sadness, but of something deeper, acceptance. Samuel approached and touched his face. "Are you crying?" Albert nodded. And then the child asked almost in a whisper, "Are you really our daddy?" The question was so pure, so disarming, that it hurt and healed at the same time. Albert knelt down and placed his hands on the child's small shoulders. "Yes, son, I am. And I'm so sorry for not having been here before." Samuel smiled shyly and hugged his neck. It was a soft, brief hug, but for Albert it had the weight of a rebirth. Isabella, who was watching everything from the kitchen window, leaned against the wall and closed her eyes. A tear escaped before she could hold it back. She knew there was still a long way to go, But at that instant, seeing Samuel in his father's arms, something inside her quieted. Perhaps, just perhaps, he really was changing. In the following days, the other children began to approach more. Gabriel asked for help with a new toy. Matthew insisted that he watch him ride his bike without training wheels. And little by little, the patio filled with laughter, with innocent conversations, with bonds that began to form where before there had only been distance. Albert kept the drawing in his wallet like an amulet. It wasn't just a child's drawing. It was the symbol of the moment he stopped being a stranger to become, for the first time, a daddy. That night, after putting the triplets to bed, Isabella found Albert sitting on the patio, gently rocking in the wicker chair, with the drawing Samuel had given him days earlier in his hands. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it carried a dormant tension, like a topic that needed to be said, but was still waiting for its moment. She sat beside him with a cup of tea in her hands. For an instant, she just looked at the star-studded sky and listened to the distant singing of a radio playing in a nearby house. Then, bluntly, she asked in a serene but firm tone, "Albert, why did you leave me?" He didn't answer immediately. He squeezed the paper between his fingers, as if looking for courage there. Finally he spoke. "Because I was a coward, and because deep down I never learned to love without fear." His voice was hoarse, broken. "You were honest with me, and I only knew how to attack, to protect myself." Isabella looked at him with tear-filled eyes. "You took everything from me that morning. The ground, hope, faith, and yet I kept going." She spoke not with resentment, but with the raw pain of someone who had to rebuild herself alone. "For months I wondered what I did wrong. Why did a night that was so real for me mean so little to you?" Albert covered his face with his hands. "It wasn't little, Isa. It was the most sincere moment I'd lived in years. But I grew up in a house where feeling was a shame, where weakness was forbidden. My father, he told me that a woman only wants one thing, the name, and I let his voice decide for me." The confession floated in the air like an exposed wound. Isabella took a deep breath. "And now, you expect me to forget everything with an apology?" She was hurt, but in her gaze something still shone, a flame waiting to be rekindled. "No, I don't expect that," he replied, looking into her eyes with an uncommon honesty. "I don't come to erase the past. I come to earn a new beginning, not for me, for them, for us, if there's still a possibility." She lowered her gaze, and discreet tears ran down her face. "You know what hurt me the most? It wasn't that you rejected me. It was seeing my children grow up without a father, and knowing that they did have one, but that he chose not to be there." The phrase fell like a hammer between them. Albert felt the blow and didn't try to defend himself. Then, in a gesture she never expected, Isabella placed her hand on his. "But they are still small. They still have time. And maybe, just maybe, we do too." It wasn't forgiveness. It was a space, a bridge between the past and the future, where something new could flourish. The wind blew colder that night, but the patio seemed to warm with something invisible. For the first time since that fateful morning, Albert felt that, despite the lost time, there was still time to love and be truly loved. The weekends took on a new rhythm. It was as if Isabella's simple house filled with more light and life every time Albert crossed the gate with a shy smile and some surprise in his hands. A new soccer ball, a puzzle, or ingredients to make chocolate cake, which he had learned was the children's favorite. At first, the triplets still observed his every gesture with unconscious caution, like someone trying to understand where presence ends and affection begins. but a few games of tag, 3 stories told in funny voices before bed, and 1 or 2 amusing stumbles while assembling toys were enough for the resistance to begin to dissolve. Albert was not good with children. At least he wasn't, until they arrived. Gabriel called him Uncle Albert at first, and although the word Daddy didn't come out often yet, there was a different sparkle in the little one's eyes when he arrived. A sparkle of recognition, of security, that is only built with consistency. Isabella watched everything with a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was beautiful to see them laugh, run after their father with little hands full of dirt, trusting, playing. But there was a part of her that still didn't dare to believe completely. After all, she knew the Albert who hurt with sharp words and hid behind his pride. Was he really changing? Or was it just a moment of fleeting remorse? One Sunday afternoon, they decided to prepare the famous chocolate cake Isabella used to make for birthdays. Albert, clumsy with flour and eggs, messed up half the kitchen, causing genuine laughter from Gabriel and Matthew. Samuel, the most serious, just said, "You need lessons with Mom." Albert laughed loudly. "Then let her teach me." Isabella, leaning against the doorframe, hands on her hips and a slight smile on her face, watched the scene. There was something so simple and precious about that moment that her chest tightened. Part of her wanted to go in and be part of the chaos, of the dough on the floor, of that recovered childhood. And another part still feared that all of it was temporary. That night, after the children fell asleep, exhausted from sugar and tiredness, Albert stayed a little longer. They sat on the patio, as was customary, but this time he brought a bottle of red wine from the winery's harvest. "I brought it because I wanted to share it with you, without a past, without promises. Just a present." She accepted the glass cautiously, and they toasted in silence. His gaze was now different. There was no longer haste or arrogant certainties. There were doubts, hope, and a patience he had learned with the children, that of waiting for the right moment. Isabella, between sips and soft laughs, allowed herself to rest her head on his shoulder for a brief instant. They said nothing, but in that gesture lived the beginning of something new. The dormant connection began to awaken, and fear, little by little, gave way to tenderness. It was as if the lost time was finally being mended with small threads of sincere affection. As he said goodbye, leaning down to leave, Albert looked at her with a shy smile. "Maybe I'm learning to love for the first time." And she, without answering, just touched his fingertips and said, "Keep coming." Because her heart, like her children's, was also learning to trust again. The reunion between Albert and his children began to take the form of a routine. Every weekend was more colorful, sweeter. A piece of childhood returned, a fraction of affection rebuilt. Isabella began, still cautiously, to believe that perhaps the future would not be as lonely as she had imagined. But life, especially when it comes to wounded hearts, rarely allows peace for long. It was on a rainy morning when the past knocked on the door with high heels and expensive perfume. Mrs. Eleanor Thorne, Albert's mother, arrived at the small house in Brighton without warning, carrying her presence as if it were a crown. Always controlling, cold as northern winters, she had never approved of any of her son's emotional decisions. But upon learning from the newspapers that he had traveled inland for personal and recurring reasons, she decided to investigate. Isabella opened the door with Samuel in her arms. She didn't recognize the woman immediately, but the surname spoken in an authoritative tone made her shiver inside. "I'm Eleanor, Albert's mother. Can we talk?" It wasn't an invitation. It was an order. Her presence filled the small room with silent judgment, and every glance was a sentence. Isabella offered tea, trying to maintain politeness, but Eleanor rejected it with disdain. "I've come to set things straight." Her eyes swept over the humble surroundings with barely disguised repulsion. "You did your job very well, Isabella. The secretary who became the mother of the heirs. The story is almost like a soap opera." Isabella maintained her composure. There was no trick. There was no plan. There was abandonment, and then decisions. The firmness in her voice surprised even herself, but Eleanor smiled coldly. "You'll end up alone again, dear. My son may be blinded by guilt, but he doesn't belong in this world, in this dusty land that smells of cheap soap." At that moment, Albert entered through the door. He had come to bring a gift for the children, but the scene froze him. His mother standing in the living room, looking at Isabella as if she were an intruder. Isabella's expression was one of restraint, but her eyes silently pleaded for help. Albert closed the door firmly. "What are you doing here, Mother?" Eleanor turned, surprised by his firm tone. "I'm saving you from a mistake that could ruin your life. You have an inheritance, a reputation. You can't throw it all away for a whim." The word fell like acid in the room. Albert took a deep breath. The old dilemma presented itself. Legacy or love, his mother's acceptance or the truth of his heart. "You don't understand," he said firmly. "These children are my life, and Isabella is the strongest and most dignified woman I have ever known." His mother let out a dry laugh. "If you continue with this, Albert, you will be disinherited. You will lose everything we built." Silence was immediate. Isabella looked at him with fear, not of the future, but of his answer. Then Albert, his voice trembling but determined, said, "If all that forces me to deny my own family, then perhaps I never had anything true." Eleanor, wounded by the blow, left without another word, leaving behind the smell of poison and unresolved past. Isabella approached, still in shock. "You don't have to do this for us." But he took her face in his hands with tenderness. "It's not for you. It's for me. Because I finally understood that love is not weakness. It's freedom." The days after the confrontation were silent, dense. Albert received no more calls from his mother or messages from his financial director. The joint account of the Thorne family was frozen. The corporate card, canceled. For the first time in his adult life, he felt the weight of being completely on his own, without the comfort of fortune, without the protection of the family name. But curiously, he felt no fear. He felt relief. The world he had known, with its crystal glasses and dinners under huge chandeliers, now seemed small, limited, and real, because what he had discovered in recent months was much bigger. The sound of his children's laughter in the morning, the aroma of Isabella's cheese bread, Samuel's shy hug when something scared him. It was a new universe, and he was willing to fight for it. Determined, Albert returned to his mother's house not to ask for forgiveness, but to say goodbye. He found her in the main living room of the Thorne estate, among marble columns and furniture inherited from generations. Eleanor didn't even get up when she saw him. "Did you come to grovel? It was about time." He smiled sadly. "No, I came to free you and to free myself." She tried to respond with sarcasm, but he interrupted her with a firmness he had never used with her before. "All my life I tried to mold myself into what you believed a Thorne should be. Strong, cold, ruthless. But now I understand that all that you call strength is actually fear, and I'm not going to live in fear anymore." Eleanor finally stood up. "Are you going to give up the winery? The empire your father built? Are you going to leave everything in the hands of strangers for a little woman and 3 bastard children?" Albert took a deep breath. There was no explosion, only a definitive calm in his reply. "They are my children, my blood, and she is the woman who taught me to love. If that makes me unworthy of the empire, then let it crumble." She screamed, called him weak, ungrateful, but he simply left. He didn't look back. He didn't hesitate. The gate of the Thorne estate closed behind him with the sound of a broken cycle. For the first time, Albert Thorne was his own man. Back in Brighton, he went straight to Isabella's house. He found her washing clothes in the laundry room, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, and the children playing with twigs in the yard. He watched her for several seconds, absorbing every detail of that simple life that was now all he desired. Isabella noticed his presence, and seeing his eyes, she understood. "She disinherited you." He nodded. "But she didn't take anything from me. She just freed me from what bound me." He approached and took her hands. "Isa, I choose you, not as a burden, not as a sacrifice, but as my only truth." She, for a moment, hesitated. Her tear-filled eyes were not of sadness, but of disbelief. "Are you sure about that?" He smiled, caressing her face gently. "For the first time, I'm sure of everything." And there, in that dusty yard and new hope, he knew that perhaps he was poor in money. Yes, but rich, absurdly rich, in what matters most. Love. The afternoon was golden, the sky tinged with peach and lilac tones. The triplets ran around the yard with improvised kites that Albert had helped them build with popsicle sticks, string, and colorful plastic bags. Gabriel laughed heartily. Samuel narrated his own race as a soccer commentator, and Matthew, focused, tried to balance the kite against the wind. It was a scene so simple and so powerful that Isabella, from the window, allowed herself to smile with eyes full of light. Albert watched them with a tenderness she had never seen in him. There was no obligation, no guilt, only presence. When one of the children tripped and fell, Albert ran, picked him up in his arms, and, as if it were natural, blew on the scraped knee. Samuel, through tears, said, "Daddy fixes everything." The phrase struck deep in Isabella, like a forgotten melody that suddenly returned. After the children fell asleep, exhausted from so much playing, Isabella sat on the patio with Albert. The silence between them was full of meaning. He approached, sat beside her, and took a folded paper from his pocket, the same drawing Samuel had given him weeks earlier. "I carry it with me wherever I go," he said, almost in a whisper. She looked at him sweetly. His face was illuminated by a softness that didn't match the man who had rejected her years ago. It was as if another person had been reborn from inside that old suit, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe. Maybe, in truth, he had changed. Albert slowly turned, his face inches from hers. "Isa, I don't just love our children, I love you." Isabella's heart raced. She felt that old desire to lose herself in his touch, in the familiar scent of his skin. But along with the desire came fear, sharp, deep, immense. She closed her eyes, feeling his lips approach, and pulled away. "No." The word came out soft, but laden with pain. He looked at her, surprised, hurt. "Isa." She stood up, crossing her arms. She didn't want to seem cruel, but she needed to be honest. "You love the children, Albert. I see it. And they love you. But what about me? Do you really love me? Or do you love the idea of repairing everything you broke?" He was silent. Her words hit him like a stone. "I don't know how to prove what I feel. I just know I don't want to be anywhere else but here." She sighed, and there were tears in her eyes, though she smiled sweetly. "I spent 3 years healing from you, 3 years learning to be strong, and now you come back with a new heart, and expect mine to surrender as if nothing had happened. Albert slowly stood up. No, I don't expect that, but I'm going to wait for you, for as long as it takes. I lost 3 years, and I don't want to lose any more, but I'm going to respect your time. He took her hand carefully, kissed the back of it, and left in silence, leaving only the sound of his footsteps on the dirt and an unspoken promise floating in the air. Isabella stood there, alone, looking at the sky that was now a dark mantle sprinkled with stars. Her heart raced, divided between fear and the memory of love. She touched her lips where there had almost been a kiss. "Is it still love?" she whispered, and she knew that answer would only come with time. The day began with the smell of rain and ended in anguish. It was almost midnight when Isabella realized something was wrong. The triplets were restless, their foreheads sweaty, and their bodies too hot. Samuel was sobbing softly in the room, while Matthew and Gabriel huddled together, tired and feverish. The thermometer confirmed her fear. All of them had high fevers. Isabella, alone and distressed, tried to remain calm. She applied compresses, offered water, but desperation set in. There were no open health centers, and the small village pharmacy had already closed. These were the moments when the weight of being a single mother hurt the most. Then, in an almost instinctive impulse, she picked up her phone and called Albert. He answered on the first ring. "Isa?" His voice, though sleepy, came with an alert tone. In a few minutes he was there, with a backpack on his shoulder and a bag with medicines and rehydration fluids. He asked nothing. He just came in and took control with a serenity Isabella never expected from him. Albert divided the tasks with her, as if he had always been part of the routine. While she cared for Samuel, he changed Gabriel's soaked clothes. He made Matthew laugh, even if only for seconds, with a silly superhero story. Afterwards, he settled the three on the large living room mattress, transformed into an improvised infirmary, and stayed there, kneeling beside them. For hours, he didn't leave his children's side. He passed a damp cloth over one's forehead, checked another's temperature, and when Isabella finally fell asleep on the sofa from exhaustion, he began to hum an old, almost forgotten song. It was a melody his mother used to sing to him when he was a child, and which he had never sung for anyone again since she left. Isabella woke up to that sound, slowly opened her eyes, and saw him there, sitting on the floor, with the 3 children around him, one in each arm. His eyes were red from tiredness, but there was tenderness in every gesture. He didn't know she was watching him. He was defenseless. He was simply a man, exhausted, but completely devoted. That image was etched into her soul. It was no longer about forgiveness. It wasn't about the past. It was about the now, about presence, care, that silent love that needed no words. She saw the man who once hurt her, and she saw for the first time the father of her children. When the sun began to peek over the horizon, tinting the sky with soft shades of orange, the children were sleeping deeply. The fever was beginning to subside. Albert, without noticing, fell asleep sitting up, still holding Samuel's hand. Isabella slowly approached, covered him with a light blanket, and stayed there by his side, sitting on the floor. She said nothing. She just rested her head on his shoulder, closed her eyes, and smiled in silence. For the first time in years, she felt protected, not as the wife of a powerful man, but as the partner of someone who, at last, had learned the value of a healing presence. The weather in Brighton was calm. After the difficult night, the triplets were running around the patio again, as if the fever were just a distant memory. Albert now visited the house every day, not out of obligation, but because there, finally, was where his heart found rest. The simple routine, the breakfast full of crumbs, and the messy hugs gave him a meaning that the Thorn Empire had never offered him. But all peace, especially that which involves still healing hearts, is fragile. One clear afternoon, while Isabella was sewing in the shade of the patio and the children were coloring the ground with chalk, a black van stopped in front of the house. A woman with dark glasses, fine heels, and a designer dress that completely clashed with the landscape got out. Her name, Camilla Hayes, Albert's ex-fiancée, walked with firm steps to the gate and smiled with perfectly made-up lips. "Hello, Isa. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Isabella stood up. Instinctively protective. "What are you doing here?" Camilla slowly took off her glasses, revealing eyes as cold as stone. "I came to get back what's mine, or rather, what always was." Minutes later, Albert arrived. Seeing Camilla, his expression hardened. "What do you want, Camilla?" She smiled like someone who believes they are in control. "Just to talk. Can we? Please?" Isabella, still holding one of her children's drawings, watched them from a distance. Her chest felt tight. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear. Fear that, deep down, there was still room for that woman in his heart. Camilla and Albert talked under the shade of a tree. She spoke of business, of how her parents were willing to forgive him if he left that village life. She told him she still loved him, that what they had could be rebuilt, that he just needed to leave that madness behind. Albert calmly replied, "You don't love me, Camilla. You never loved the idea of that Albert Thorn, whom you molded to fit into your gala dinners. I am no longer that man, and even if I were, I would never return to what has no soul." Camilla let out a cynical laugh. "Are you going to trade all this for a little woman, and 3 children who weren't even wanted?" He looked at her firmly. "They were wanted, even before they were born. I just didn't know it yet." Camilla left furiously, but the damage was already done. Isabella, who had seen everything from the window, felt the old insecurity tightening her chest. That night, as she tucked the children into bed, Camilla's voice echoed in her mind. "Do you really think he's going to stay here forever?" Later, when Albert approached to offer help in the kitchen, she pulled away. "Maybe it would be better if you took some time to think clearly. All this may seem nice now, but maybe you're just trying to compensate." He looked at her, surprised and hurt. "Do you think this is guilt? Isa, I chose you. I chose them." She looked away. "But when all this passes, will you still want this simple life? Will you want the woman you threw out?" There were hidden tears in her voice, and for the first time in weeks, the distance between them was felt again. Albert took a deep breath. "If I have to prove again that I belong to you, I will. But please, don't run away again just because you're afraid of being truly loved." Isabella didn't answer. She just gently closed the bedroom door, taking with her a whirlwind of emotions she thought she had overcome. Camilla's words and the insecurities Isabella had buried resurfaced like persistent ghosts. No matter how much Albert spoke, demonstrated, strove with gestures and actions, there was a corner inside her that still feared being just a chapter of redemption in his story. Not the happy ending, just the bridge between a mistake and a success. That dawn, Isabella looked at her sleeping children, each sprawled in a different way on the shared mattress. She caressed Samuel's hair, kissed Matthew's forehead, adjusted Gabriel's blanket. Her love for them was greater than everything, even greater than her own desire to stay. And that's why she decided to leave, perhaps far from here. He'll understand what he really wants, she whispered to herself, swallowing her tears. The next morning, without telling anyone, she packed some clothes, documents, and the children's favorite toys. To Mrs. Francis, she left a simple letter. "Thank you for everything. I will never forget it. I'm doing what I think is best." She bought tickets to a distant city where a cousin had offered her refuge. She planned to start over, for the 4th time, with her children in her arms and her heart broken. The bus would leave at 6:20. Isabella silently said goodbye to the corners of the house. She touched the wall where the children had made their first scribbles. She took the drawing with the 5 stick figures of the family holding hands, the same one Albert always carried with him, and put it in her bag. She didn't want him to see it there when he noticed she was gone. Albert arrived at 5:45 p.m. He brought illustrated books for a new story night and a wooden toy he had learned to make with Mrs. Francis. Seeing the empty house, he felt a punch in his chest. "Isabella," he called. Nothing. He found the folded letter on the kitchen chair, and reading it, his vision blurred. Her words were sweet, but definitive. "They are all yours now, and that's what matters." Panic enveloped him like a wave. He ran out, his heart pounding. He asked the neighbor if he had seen anything. Yes, she took a taxi with the children. They said something about the bus station. He didn't think. He got in the car and drove like never before, running red lights, ignoring honks, praying to arrive on time. At the terminal, the buses were already starting their engines. Albert jumped out of the car and ran down the platform shouting his children's names. "Gabriel! Matthew! Samuel!" People looked at him strangely, but he didn't care. And then he heard it. A small, innocent voice. "Daddy?" He turned and saw Gabriel in Isabella's arms, pointing at him with wide eyes. She was standing by the bus, with her suitcases at her feet, and her eyes full of tears. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice breaking. Albert ran to them, panting, his eyes desperate. "Don't do this, Isa, please. Don't run away from me again." She looked at him, her face wet, the children around them not understanding. "I just don't want to be the obstacle. I don't want to be the woman who ties you to a life you might not want anymore." Albert took her hands tightly. "You don't tie me. You free me. You and these children are all I want, all I chose. Please, stay." Isabella's eyes filled with hope. For the first time, she didn't hear promises. She saw truth. And on that concrete platform, surrounded by goodbyes and reunions, she allowed herself to understand that loving was also letting herself be cared for. Then, she dropped her suitcase, knelt to hug her children, and whispered, "Let's go home." The night was serene, and the clear sky seemed to bless the village with a peace-filled silence. Back home, Isabella prepared hot chocolate for the children who were running in circles with renewed energy. They didn't understand the words the adults had exchanged, but they felt it in the air and in their hearts. Something had changed. The fear had dissolved. The home was finally complete. Albert stood by the door, watching the scene with tear-filled eyes. In recent months, he had felt love blossom in the details. In each shy hug from his children, in Isabella's reserved smile, in the simple dinners shared under the dim kitchen light. But now he knew he needed to say, in no uncertain terms, what he had kept inside. He asked for a moment. He called the children and Isabella to the patio, where the full moon illuminated the dew-damp grass. Isabella, with some distrust, followed him with the children in her arms. Gabriel tugged at Albert's pant leg, smiling. Samuel carried his inseparable toy car. Matthew leaned against his mother's leg. Albert took a deep breath. Then he knelt on the ground, without ceremony, without rehearsal. only with the truth. He placed his hands on the earth and looked at the 4 faces in front of him. 3 small ones, and one he loved with a new intensity. I need to say something I perhaps took too long to understand. The children stopped. Isabella held her breath. I love you, Albert said. His voice trembled for an instant. I love every laugh, every mischief, every sweaty hug at the end of the day. You are my children, my pride, my light. His eyes filled with tears. But more than that, I love your mom. I love her strength, her courage, the way she loves you, and how she taught me to love too. Matthew smiled. Samuel approached and touched his daddy's shoulder. Isabella remained motionless, fighting back the tears that wanted to come out. Albert looked at her firmly, his heart pounding with the words that were about to come. Isa, you were my truth in the midst of chaos. You were what remained when everything fell apart, and also what rebuilt me. And that's why today, in front of our children, under this sky that saw us born, suffer, and be reborn, I tell you, I choose you, 1,000 times, every day, with fear, with mistakes, with everything. I choose you. He opened his arms, and the 3 children ran to him, forming an entangled hug amidst laughter and sobs. Isabella fell to her knees beside him, overcome by a liberating cry. It was not of pain. It was of relief. Albert pulled her close, and there they stayed, all 5 of them, hugging as if the world stopped to celebrate that instant. That night there was no ring, no altar, no elegantly dressed witnesses. But there was a promise, and it was made with an open heart, with the past healed, with a firm gaze in their eyes, and with the certainty that they had finally found what they had sought for so long, a home. Time passed with the lightness of a new beginning. The simple life beside Isabella and the children had no luxuries, but it was rich in affection and meaning. Albert learned to plant, to repair the house roof, and even to make crooked pancakes on Sundays. He discovered that happiness lives in the details, in the drawings his children made with chalk on the sidewalk, in the coffee lovingly made by Isabella, and in the sound of her laughter when he hugged her by surprise. With the support of friends from the village and some old contacts who, curiously, admired his decision to change his life, Albert began a small artisanal winery project, not with the pomp of thorn, but with soul. He named his first harvest the Triplets, in honor of his children. The label bore 5 childlike strokes drawn by Gabriel, Matthew, and Samuel. It was, according to him, his best creation, but there was something he still hadn't done, something that needed to be said, formalized, sealed. Not because their love demanded it, but because his heart wanted to show the whole world that there were no longer any doubts. So one Saturday afternoon, when the sky was golden like honey, and the sea lazily hit the rocks, he prepared a surprise. He took Isabella and the children to the beach, where they had walked together for the first time. With the help of Mrs. Francis and some neighbors, he arranged a small altar made of bamboo and wildflowers. Simple, intimate, perfect. Isabella wore a light dress that danced with the wind. Arriving at the spot, she opened her eyes in astonishment to see the children dressed in white shirts and linen pants, carrying small baskets with petals. "Albert, what is this?" she asked, between laughter and tears. He approached, smiling. "It's the moment I dreamed of, since I understood what really matters." He knelt in the sand, holding a small wooden box. "Isabella Rivers, you taught me what it is to love without expecting anything in return. You gave me the greatest gifts in life. You showed me that peace is sleeping with your children by your side and waking up to the smell of your coffee. I have no riches or castles, but I have a whole heart, and it's yours. Will you marry me?" Isabella brought her hands to her mouth. Tears fell unashamedly. The children ran around, throwing petals over them, amidst innocent shouts of, "Mommy, say yes, say yes!" She looked into his eyes, and without hesitation replied, her voice choked. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The hug was long, laden with emotion, with the children throwing themselves on top as if they were part of the bond. And they were. Because there on that fine sand, bathed by promises and by salt, something new was born. Not just a couple, but an entire, rebuilt family. The sun bid farewell on the horizon, while laughter, applause, and tears filled the air. The pain of the past finally remained behind. And in front of the sea, which had known their silences, and was now a witness to their smiles, Isabella and Albert sealed the certainty that life, guided by love, always gives a new opportunity. The night breeze entered through the kitchen window, bringing with it the smell of the sea and the distant sound of waves gently breaking on the sand. The house was filled with voices, laughter, and dishes passing from hand to hand. The small dinner was just for them. Albert, Isabella, the triplets, Mrs. Francis, and 2 or 3 neighbors who had become part of the family. No luxuries, but everything overflowed with warmth. The table, made by Albert with repurposed wood, was set with simplicity and love. Colorful clay plates, mismatched glasses, but full of natural juice and joy. Samuel asked for more rice. Gabriel proudly showed off his newly lost tooth, and Matthew insisted that everyone listen to the story he had written about a dragon who wanted to be a dancer. Isabella, now with a simple gold ring on her finger, watched everything in silence for an instant, like someone taking a photograph with her soul. The home she once dreamed of building, not with bricks but with bonds, was now real. Every detail, every gesture, was part of something she had long thought impossible. Peace. Albert looked at her with tenderness. His eyes no longer carried guilt, but the sparkle of a man who had finally found his place in the world. He knew that none of this would have been possible without her courage, without her forgiveness. And now, the life they built together was his greatest legacy. Mrs. Francis always knew. She raised a toast with a thick glass. To this beautiful family, and to the miracle of starting over. Everyone clinked their glasses, even the children who toasted with juice, and laughed so loudly that the house floor vibrated with joy. Later, as the children fell asleep one by one on the sofa, Isabella and Albert went out to the porch. They sat side by side with bare feet, the starry sky above them, and their hearts in silence. There was no longer any rush, just presence. Albert hugged her by the waist and kissed her hair. "I still can't believe all this is real," he whispered. She smiled with her eyes closed. "It's real, because we chose to fight, not to run away." Then Isabella slowly stood up, looked at him, and then towards the inside of the house, where the children slept embraced. And in thought, as if narrating to herself, she said softly, "Fate can separate, but love always finds its way back." The imaginary camera of life would zoom out at that moment, revealing the small house illuminated from within, with sleeping laughter that still resonated between walls that now held more than memories. They held fulfilled promises. The sea continued its course, the stars twinkled discreetly, and peace was finally home. They were no longer fragments of a broken story. Now they were one, a family, a home, a love that triumphed. I invite you to leave your opinion about this incredible story in the comments. If you liked it, share it, and subscribe to the channel to support our work. Another story is appearing on your screen that will probably also move you. Don't miss it.